Okay, in this video, we're going to respond to a question that we got about, is the double bridle classical? Why aren't we seeing in the Grand Prix test the sort of old La Guérinière 18th century type bits? And what's our response to a recent rule in Sweden opening up the Grand Prix to people riding in Snaffles? I think these are really good three-part question, so that's what we're going to talk about. If you like it, thumb-a-tee, up-a-tees, subscribe-a-tee, wibe-a-tees, and yeah, it's so annoying when people ask you to do this stuff, I know, but it does make a difference. Let's jump in. Welcome back, fellow rockers and horse nerds. I'm here with Richard Williams, if you haven't seen our other videos. Richard Williams is the publisher of Xenophon Press, which does all this cool stuff from the old masters. It's all the old dead dude stuff that we all rely upon to train our horses in the old dead dudes fashion, which is a good idea because the old dead dudes were jolly clever chaps. All right, so if we want to do the classical thing, we've got to follow the classical text, which this guy publishes for us. And he does it cheaply, and he does it thanklessly. He doesn't make any money at it, which is why, sadly, he's not sponsoring this video series, even though actually I'm sort of sponsoring his because I want you all to buy his books because they are rad and necessary. All right, there's the plug. So we received this question, which is a jolly interesting one. Mr. Isaacson, that's me, I wonder if you could have an interview discussion with Richard Williams, that's him, regarding the classical bits of Guérinière era, that means the 18th century, means those long-shank bits, versus the modern sport double bridle. Is the double bridle classical? Good question. Bits are kind of a hot topic nowadays because of sport and Cavesson tightness, etc. Ooh, so we have to talk about Cavessons as well. Also, Sweden has just approved the use of Snaffle bits for use in CDI Grand Prix classes. Why don't they just approve the use of a classical curb bit or Portuguese bridle? I think by that you kind of mean probably a working equitation bridle for sport dressage. Thank you very much, Marty. All right, so we're going to attempt to answer this. So we're going to have to break this question up into its component parts. The first bit, Richard, is the double bridle classical?
Well, it depends on how you define classical.
Let's define classical.
Right. So the double bridle, and you're a better historian than I am, but the double bridle came into use in the 19th century.
Indeed.
And do you want to give a little bit of background?
I can talk about why it came in, and then, yeah. Okay, so what happened in the 19th century was the thoroughbred horse kind of took over. And even the early warm bloods of the day were very thoroughbred-y, Tricanas, that sort of thing. And so something called Anglomania also kicked in, which was the hunting and jumping and having fast fun on horses where you're kind of going in two dimensions.
Now, you're saying that actually came to the continent, right?
It came to the continent.
The French got really excited about going fast over fields.
Hunting, effectively.
Right.
Hunting, people chasing. The
well.
Germans did. Everyone got into it. But they were also dressage riders as well. And if you look at those early hunting prints, you'll often see people riding from the early 19th century, this new thing called the double bridle. And the reason was because they knew they needed to have the bradoon, the snaffle bit, for the jumpies, but they also needed brakes because they were often going in crowds of like 100 people going at these big fences with their horses running away with them. So they wanted brakes, and sometimes when the hounds were not like running full tilt, they might go like into a ravine with twisties and little jumps that you have to like do in a trappy way, and then they want the horse more on the haunches and in hand. So the double bridle kind of crept in as a way of making a compromise between the old curb tradition of not just the arena riding, but the cavalry riding in close combat, where you need the horse like on the haunches all the time, and this new kind of going to the shoulders thing, where you need to go fast and jump. Then, of course, the fox hunters say, it's too much in the horse's mouth. We might spin the horse over backwards if we have a bad moment and yank the horse in the mouth over a jump. So they then invent the pelham and the kimblewick. And the double bridle stays with the dressage people, mostly on the continent actually, and becomes the bit of choice. However, it was never intended, this is really important, it was never intended as the goal itself. The reason why you can separate these two bits is the idea is you're still going towards riding with a long curb bit, a shank bit, like that La Guerinière 18th century era thing, or the working equitation, simple curb bits you'd see today, or indeed the Western bits. They're all variations on the same theme. And the idea is you're just supposed to ride with your left hand like this and just have very small indications of the hand. But of course, this is predicated, if it's going to work and not be horrible for the horse, on the rider being really well prepared in the seat and really well prepared in the hand, and the horse having gone through a preparation as well that in the old days was called the débourrage, and it came before the dressage. And the débourrage, which in French kind of means like the scraping off, the cleaning up, is the first 2-3 years of training of the horse. The dressage, dresser in Old French means to put together. That's all it means. So you're putting the hind legs under the point of gravity. That's when the curb bit would creep in. And there'd be a progression with a Bridoon, sometimes with a Cavesson as well, and then eventually to just this bit with the left hand here. So the double bridle was a sort of slightly English thing that went to the continent and then stayed there because people found it quite useful, because in addition to doing the dressages, they also wanted to do the jumpies. By the time you hit the mid-19th century, most people, even on the continent, they want to have fun on their horses across country as well as working in the manège, in the arena, doing the dressage-wages. So everyone seems to find this a useful tool, but it just is worth saying that it's supposed to be a transition to those bits of the La Guerinière era. But yes, it's classical, because anything that comes from a previous generation into this generation is therefore classical. Like if I'm driving my car and I switch on the classic rock station and they're playing Nirvana and I'm like, hey, that's not classic rock. And then I'm like, well, actually it is, I'm kind of old now. It's come from a previous generation. Nirvana was now a previous generation. So yes, it's classical in that sense, but it's not as old as La Guerinière. I hope that clarifies.
Yeah.
All right.
And so I'm just going to go back a little bit. We have also published a book on the Italian Renaissance masters, including, Fieschi and Grissone and Pignatelli, and that book was
That's
written,
16th century.
Yeah.
Old. Yeah.
So that was written by G.B. Tomasini. It's a very, very good, book on even earlier history than de la Guerinière, who's basically early part of the 1700s. So in those days, they would have these riding texts, and they were approximately divided into 3 parts. They would have 1/3 of the book would be on bits, another third of the book would be on shoeing, and another third of the book would be on how to train your horses. So today, if we think about this in our how-to books, we don't have much at all on bits. So I think this is why this is the question. But it was also thought in the Renaissance that, you could change the horse by changing the bit. And what happens from the Renaissance into the Age of Enlightenment is they say, well, it's kind of what you do with that bit. So any bit, even a soft, fat German Snaffle or a fine Bridoon or a long-shanked curb bit, any of these bits can be a razor blade in the hand of a monkey.
Indeed.
So literally, but they can also be super soft. So the other end of the bit is what's at the other end of the rein. What is, as I like to say,
A monkey.
The unidentified flying object at the other end of the rein, which is the rider's hand. So that is the rider's responsibility to educate the hand, and we can't educate the hand until we have a balanced, independently balanced seat.
And this is a gradual process.
Right. So that happens over years, and sometimes riders, as we talked about yesterday or in another video, that riders have to spend 18 months or 2 years in the saddle, riding schoolmasters or being lunged with no contact with the rein, just so that they develop the basically what we would call now core stability in the movement. So what happens from the Renaissance into, let's say, Duke of Newcastle is we start to see
16th to 17th century.
right? So we start to see the use of the Cavesson. So the Cavesson being a big separate noseband that has usually 3 attachments, one
And
in the
some weight on it.
yeah, one in the center and 2 rings on the side, and then there are actual reins going from the Cavesson to the rider. So sometimes when horses were being transitioned from the débourrage to becoming a riding horse, they would just put the Cavesson on and ride with the Cavesson and teach that.
In the same way, in the Western world today, they still, like the California vaqueros, will start with what they call a bozal or a
Right,
bozalito.
right.
It's the same idea. Yeah.
Although one can argue that the bozal is maybe too severe, and yeah.
Right,
so
but it's a similar concept.
It's a similar concept. And so what they would do is they would teach a little bit bending, positioning, yielding to the positioning that the rider's giving to the horse, usually in the direction of travel, with the Cavesson to protect the horse's mouth. So they wouldn't do this basic, pardon my French, but they wouldn't do the steering with the curb bit.
Yeah.
So they would teach all these movements, whether it's shoulder in on a circle, or haunches out on a circle, or renvers, or half pass, in the arena. They would teach all of this to the rider and to the horse with the Cavesson first. And so what happened,
yeah.
And so they would have the Cavesson on.
And then there would be a gradual thing of Cavesson plus bit.
Yeah, so then they would have Cavesson, and they would have big long-shank bridle, what we would call the full bridle, which is just a shank bit. And then the rider would try to transition these movements and try to see if they were refined enough to do it without the Cavesson anymore. They would drop the Cavesson rein and try to do things with the bridle rein, and then they could always convert back. So the young horse was given this idea of just basic steering with the small filet, or what's the
Snaffle.
The snaffle, or the
Bridoon.
The bridoon. So these are actually pictured in the page 150 of this is a slightly enlarged version of School of Horsemanship.
La Guerinière Bible. This is basically your Bible.
Yeah,
this is what we all kind of work to.
1736. But in this book, there are all of these bits. So they had single-jointed bridoons. They had double-jointed bridoons. They had ported curb bits. And these were actually, in those days, the cannon, which is the mouthpiece that comes across, they were actually interchangeable. They had thumb screws on either end, decorative thumb screws, and they could switch out
from horse to horse.
From horse to horse.
Of horse's mouth.
So they could make this wider or narrower, and they could have larger ports, smaller ports. They could even have a jointed port, or a jointed part with a little, and these are actually those end pieces.
Because consider this, guys. They weren't mass producing bits in China, right? If you wanted a bit, someone actually had to make that bit for you. And if you're in a village, that was your local blacksmith who specialized in that. And his name was the loriner. The loriner was the blacksmith who specialized in making bits. And he would come and measure your horse's mouth, and he would make the bits for your horse. And then if you were a gentleman, like one of these guys, like La Guerinière, you're going to have master loriners whose like entire job in the royal stables is to constantly be working on whether, like the saddle fitters that go around today, you know. So there was no mass production of bits at that point.
So then it begs the question, why didn't de la Grenière have the two bits in the mouth? Well, what happens in the before the French Revolution is the classical school, the school of Versailles, and the equivalents. So that would be also in Vienna, it would be in Hanover,
Eisenberg, people like that.
Yeah, it would be
Regenthal,
exactly.
Vienna.
So what they were working on is ultimate collection and seating the horse. So movements that we don't see in that century, we don't see tempi flying changes.
Yeah, they weren't doing that
So
back then.
that was not happening. They were working with a seated balance. Why? Because they were training and I like to say they were training the horses for royalty. And royalty actually wanted to go slow, and they wanted to do pageantry. So the royalty would be enthroned on the horse, and they would often have an entourage holding umbrellas for them, and they would have foot people. So they had to canter, they had to passage at the rate that people on the ground.
Terre-à-terre, the piaffe and canter, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
So they had to canter that slow and trot that slow, so their underlings that were accompanying them could accompany them on foot.
And also, so they didn't fall off in public. Can
Right.
you imagine? You're the king, you're going through Paris.
It's not a good look.
It's not, no. It's not going to aid your stemming of the revolutionary tides. If
Right.
you ended with arse in mud, yeah.
So then, as we all know, what happened in the French Revolution, people started to rebel. We all know about the tanneries.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Well, the tanneries that were tanning leather were dumping toxins into the Seine, and there was no drinking water, and they were taxing them, and Marie Antoinette, etc. And she's like, well, if they're hungry, why don't they
eat cake.
let them eat cake? We have all these cakes. We have petit fours. We have stacks of cakes. So there was this huge, and we don't have to get into the French
the
Revolution.
gap between rich and poor got rather wide.
Yeah, it got very,
and the
very
abuses
wide.
from the rich to the poor became rather big.
Yeah, so this cost the royalty their position, and also a lot of them their heads. So what comes up now are the working classes and the business people who are now not overtaxed by royalty. So they come up in the 19th century and they say, we oppose.
We reject all that stuff that
all
came
of this
before.
kingly kind of riding. We want something more exciting. So
They
that's
say
what.
those guys were poopy butts.
Right. So one of the things that they said was,
I think
we
poopy
really
butt
like.
is the correct
Yeah,
equestrian
yes.
term. Poopy butts, yeah.
And they said, well, we see these Englishmen, they're running over the countryside and they're going really fast, and that looks like a lot of fun, and that looks very different than what the kings were doing.
Indeed.
The other thing that they see in the 19th century is they see the development of the circus, especially in Paris, but also in other
Public entertainments of equestrianism. Yes.
Right. So this is where Francois Boucher comes to popularity, because he's riding in a piste, which is basically an 18-meter, 14-meter diameter circle, and coming up with new-fangled showstoppers every month and impressing the crowds. So he would come up with various things that people had never seen before.
Like the one-time tempies.
Like the one-time tempi or the two-time tempi. How did he invent them? There was a horse that was at the knackers that was taken to the knackers to be sold for horse meat. He would buy the horse with the evasion of jumping 20 feet over a giant mud puddle, or not staying on the same lead for more than one stride, and evading the rider by changing leads back and forth. He would buy that horse for a little bit more money than meat, and he would take it back and said, okay, now I'm going to teach this horse to do this on command. And then this would become the new heir. So
Quite brilliant, actually.
Right, right. And so what we have in our Grand Prix test, to answer your question, what we have in our Grand Prix test today, and a lot of people don't, even Grand Prix riders, I'm not sure all of them know this, is we have a combination of what's called horizontal balance movements and seated balance movements. For example, obvious seated balance movements should be the halt, the piaffe, and the canter pirouette. These are from the 18th century and earlier. Those require a seated haunch horse. To go to the one tempi changes and the two tempi changes, the rider actually changes the balance and more equalizes the weight carried by the front end and the back end.
Also with the extensions as well.
And with the extended trots. And these, de la Garnière does not say not to do forward trot. He doesn't call it extended.
But it's just not part of the conversation, really.
Right. He does say at the end of your ride, you need to ride the horse briskly forward in a straight line to refresh the horse and return him to the stall so that he has had this good circulation if there's any accumulation of lactic acid or...
Yeah. The idea of stretching after collecting has been around for a long time, but they weren't specifically extending in the way that we do
They
today.
weren't showing off the extended canter, showing off the collected canter, or showing off the difference between these two. So what happens in why the double bridle that we know today, why it's stuck around for so long is, for example, when I'm teaching riders, I'm teaching them to do a canter pirouette or piaffe, I might ask them to be a little bit more on the Verdun or on the curb, to ask for a little bit more seated position, a little bit more seated stance. And if I'm asking a rider to go forward into, let's say, one tempi changes, I tend to have, and I do ride the horses a little bit more on the Verdun, because the Verdun is going to allow me,
Snaffle,
the Verdun is going to allow me a little bit this ever so slight positioning, and it's also not going to get my horse overflexed.
So basically, that you in a Grand Prix test today, you had to go from the haunches to the shoulder and back to the haunches. You had to go from 18th century to 19th century and back again a bunch of times. So you've got a thing in the horse's mouth that basically allows that to happen. And it's a 19th century tool, because it's in the 19th century that these movements on the shoulders, like the tempis and the extensions, creep in and join the seated movements that were there before, like the pirouettes, like the piaffes, etc., like the terre-à-terres, of course, not in dressage tests anymore. The second part of that question, if you remember, was why don't they then, in a dressage test, have the simple curb like you'd see in a Portuguese working equitation thing? Because in the Portuguese working equitation, you stay on the haunches. Because if you're effectively working cattle, which is what it's supposed to emulate, and of course in the upper levels of working equitation, or more properly doma vaquera, you do actually work the cattle. But you also work with the garrocha, so you work with the lance, dancing the patterns around the lance, and you also do piaffes and passages as well. So it's a really lovely mixture. But all of those are pretty much on the haunches, with the very small exception of they jump a straw bale, but it's like that big, and they do a bit of speed. But the speed that they do, the horse stays in a pretty collected state. It's the speed you use to go quickly after the cow for a moment and then go back to the spinnies that you need to do to work a cow. So if you are only in that bit, you might not have the same versatility for going to the shoulders again that you would in a double bridle. But also remember, the double bridle comes out of Northern Europe. What happens is this thing called the Industrial Revolution as well. So all the money by the mid-19th century is up there in England, France, Germany, Denmark, places that industrialized. Down in Iberia, they didn't industrialize. So they were kind of not really part of the conversation by that point. So your Frenchies and your Brits and your Germans and all these people, they're not talking at that point really to the people sort of south of them, down in the Mediterranean world. So they get kind of marginalized. So there is also that reason. And that's also, by the way, why we end up riding the warm bloods in the dressage as well, because what happens when everyone gets together to revive the Olympics at the end of the 19th century, you have a bunch of blokes sitting around a table, mostly from these industrialized countries, because they're the ones who got the money to put on this type of competition. and they say, well, okay, we've decided all the sports we want, because it's not just equestrian sports, right? It's all of them: cycling, swimming, shooting, pentathlon, whatever, discus. And they say, we need rules. And so the British are there going, well, I'm a bit busy running the old empire. What? I haven't got time for this frippery. And the French are like, well, you know, what is a rule? It is an intellectual concept. And the Italians sort of wonder what's for lunch. And the Germans say, we like rules. And everyone breathes a sigh of relief.
Thank God the Germans are making the rules.
So the Germans write the rules for everything, not just for the horses. And of course, what do? They write it kind of for the horse that they kind of know, because they're developing the warm blood a little bit at that point. And they're using the double bridle by this point, etc., etc. So if the Portuguese had written the rules, well, yeah, things actually might look different. So these accidents of history, you sort of can't, you have to take these things into account as well.
So the other thing that we have to consider about, 1896 or late 19th century, even the early part of the 20th century, the automobile, the lorry is not really a thing. It's sort of a rarity. And so if we think about...
It's ships and trains.
Yeah, ships and trains. And so if we think about like the danger and expense of taking horses from Spain or from Portugal through the mountain ranges all the way up to compete in Central Europe, or from Italy for that matter, to come way from this long boot-shaped peninsula and risk your horse, plus the time, the wear and tear on the horse, the uncertainty of like,
the heat.
Is that train going to be having smooth stops?
Yeah.
Or is it going to have jerky stops and starts?
Get stuck in the Alps.
And, so I think that a lot of the competition was basically Central Europe.
And here's an interesting thing to consider. In the 16th to the 18th century, you've got everyone in Northern Europe actively trying to bring horses up from Spain and Portugal, and they're doing it either on ships or they're actually riding them up. And then somewhere with the Industrial Revolution, it stops, and everyone in north of a certain line gets very nationalistic. The Brits, we're all about our thoroughbreds and our hunters, because we've got draft crosses that we're using for those, and those become proto-warm bloods. You've got the Germans, they begin to develop from the stud in Trakehner, and then they go out to Oldenburg, and then they go to Hanover, and then they're doing all their warm bloods too. The Dutch are trying to lighten up their Gelderlanders. The Swedes, the Danish, they're all producing sport horses. So everyone gets kind of really nationalistic at this point. And it's quite interesting because, of course, we start to fight rather nationalistic wars at this point as well. But it's interesting how these fashions or these phases of history dictate, what people end up doing. Of course they do. So as much of this is as much cultural as it is, say, biomechanical. There's one thing I want to say about those old long curb bits is, if you've ever actually used them, and if you go to places where they do like the really old Baroque displays, you'll see those old bits being used, and I've certainly tried them. They're actually very, very comfortable for horses. They look extreme, but they're not. Just like very good Western bits, if they're in the hand of the right rider, they're actually more comfortable, weirdly, than Snaffles. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so it's actually a bit of a misunderstanding, weirdly, that a Snaffle bit is a kind bit. Weirdly, it's so paradoxical. The reason why you start young horses with Snaffles or beginner riders with Snaffles is because there is a limit to the amount of damage that you can do with them. But they're not by their nature kind, because they sit directly on the bars of the mouth. And what snaffle means in Old English is to steal or to snatch. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into what is the action of that bit. And then, as Richard was saying in a previous video, you're not actually supposed to use a snaffle with equal pressure ever. You're supposed to be trained to go effectively inside leg to outside rein, so that you're not having this kind of bearing down on both bars effect for the horse. But of course, a rider that's not trained in that, and many are not, will often be told they've got to pull and yank to steer. This is not nice at all. When a horse and a rider are prepared, and this takes some years, to use a curb, weirdly, it's more comfortable for the horse because the action is not directly on the bars of the mount. It's not directly on the gums. It's a bit more here to the sides. It's a bit more on the pole. The rider can then often ride just on the weight of the reins, what people call the descente du main, which we should probably do a video on at some point, but the letting go of the hand and the horse carrying himself and having much less interference from the rider. So that's actually nicer from the horse's point of view. Problem is, it's a fair old bit of preparation for both the monkey and the pony. So there is this idea that the snaffle bit is kinder. I wouldn't say it necessarily is. I'd actually say the curb bit in the right hands is kinder, but the curb bit in the wrong hands is insanely unkind. And the snaffle bit in uneducated hands, there is at least a limit to the damage that can be done. So this whole thing around bitting is an interesting one because people aren't taught anymore, back to what you were saying with La Guerinière at the start of this conversation, that you're supposed to go brozal or Cavesson, and then Cavesson with a bit, probably a snaffle, or they could call it a bradoon or a filet, but it's the same idea. And then from there to a curb, sometimes with the Cavesson as well, to keep the concepts easy for the horse to understand, and then eventually just the curb. There's supposed to be this progression. Or, in the modern day, snaffle to double bridle, and then perhaps a simple curb. Or in the Western tradition, brozal or brozalito to some sort of bit held passively to eventually a Western type of bit. It's all the same kind of gradual concept. But when I was a kid at riding schools in England, nobody taught this. Nobody knew. No. You know, so it's not surprising that there's all this confusion. And that, frankly, is why we owe a debt of gratitude to this bloke sitting next to me here, because he's still keeping these books in print that allow us to check in with what the old dead dudes were doing. Why were they doing it so effectively? If we don't have those books, it'll get lost from our culture. We won't know. And then what happens is it just has to be passed on orally. And then you just hope that those people don't die, you know. So we got to have these texts.
So the other thing that I want to respond to is the person who asked the question is like, okay, Sweden has now passed a rule nationally that they can ride the Grand Prix test in with a snaffle bit. And that's probably the first nation. And I believe that is also a reaction to some riders and trainers in Sweden saying, okay, we don't like the way we're seeing the trend of the double bridle being used. We don't like tight nosebands. We think...
I don't like tight nosebands either,
We don't like bare chains. We don't like the preponderance of contact on the curb rein or the long shanks. And we, as a matter of pride, want to demonstrate that we can create both the seated posture for the things like piaffe and passage and pirouette, although the passage is a little less seated than the...
Sort of in between, yes.
Yeah, but these highly seated things with the snaffle bit, because we have good hands, because we're showing and we're peeling back the covering.
Yeah, so the soft dress. And it's a good endeavor that Sweden is doing this. Or, you know, frankly, by extension, there should really be no reason why you shouldn't do a Grand Prix test bridleless if you can. I mean, we've got... My wife, who's actually behind that camera right now, can basically do that on her horse. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to show that. It's going to be a minority of riders that will be able to. But yeah, absolutely the rules should be that flexible. The only reason they're not really is because it all came out of the military, and the military liked to, you know, standardize
keep everything the same.
Yeah.
But then you ask the question, why don't we just have the option to ride the Grand Prix test with a shank bit and no bradoon? Well, here's the thing. We still have these movements. We have the movements like extended trot, extended canter. If you've gone from one movement that requires deeply seated and we have this in the Grand Prix test, where we have a pirouette on the center line, and then which is a seated movement.
And then immediately
you immediately have to, either in the Grand Prix Special or in the Grand Prix, you either have to go forward and do a single flying change, or you have to do 9 one-tempies, which is a horizontal balance, followed immediately by a canter pirouette,
followed by some extension.
The other thing, so you're going back and forth and back and forth. So that's a very, very short period of time between the end of the pirouette and the beginning of the series of tempi, or the end of the tempi and the beginning of the pirouette, to know for sure that you can open the horse's throat latch, let the neck extend slightly to match these larger gaits. So that is not as easy to do as to extend once the horse has been seated and has obeyed and gotten into this position, if you don't have another bit to sort of transition to.
So that's the logic of the double bridle in that context. But yeah, if you can do it in a snaffle, do it in a snaffle. If you can do it without a bridle, do it without a bridle.
And if you can do it with a full curb, you know, I think that this is probably where we're going. We're probably going with a revision of the rules. There's been a huge rule. There's a new FEI blood rule as of a couple of days ago, I think. Yeah. And that is the stewards after the show, after the rider comes into the ring.
Stewards drink the blood of the riders.
If the steward sees blood before, if the judge sees blood, if the steward sees any blood on the horse after, in the bit check, the steward can go back to the judge at sea, give the evidence, and the judge can then eliminate the rider. So this is a revision of rules because there were incidents, right? It's all in response to incidents. So I believe that nobody sets out to do a terrible job. I think people are trying to revise. I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
I think that people...
It's all coming from a point of compassion at the end of the day.
And people are also responding to extremes that they see in competition. And it's good that we see people saying, hey, we don't want this associated with our art, with our sport. This is giving the sport a bad name. And so we have, more stringent rules. And these rules get made and revised based on need.
And we need to be sure that our culture, whether you're doing it for sport or whether you're doing like we are just for the endeavor of the thing, that it's a living culture, it's an organism, it's constantly developing, it's like language, it's like art, it's like anything. Yes, it's classical because we are doing the thing our forefathers did, and sometimes we might experiment with doing it in the exact way that our forefathers did, just to check that that is still possible to do. But the whole thing is supposed to be an ever-evolving, ever-changing, ever-developing organism, culture, three-dimensional. That's just the nature of life. That's the nature of nature, right? We should embrace that, I think. Richard, thanks. I think that you answered that question really well.
Well, we answered it.
Yeah, but I think the particular insights that you have really allowed for the elucidation of that. I can provide more context. You can provide much more clarity on the technical aspect. So, thank you for that, and thank you for publishing the books that allow us to do that. So, if this was in any way helpful to you, if this was entertaining, then please remember. It is so important. You've got to hit the thummy up thing and that little black subscribe button, because that is what tells the algorithm to pay attention to this kind of content so that it will actually pop up in your feed and in the feed of other people. So please like and subscribe. If you want to learn how to do this stuff, particularly the in-hand work that we specialize in, you'll see there's that little link down below. There's a free course. If you want to actually come and work with our ponies with us, you can just go to that same website, which is longridehome.com, and you can send us an email and we can make a plan about working together with ponies, which is always fun. And do remember to check out Xenophon Press, because without this dude here publishing all the old dead dudes, even though he's such a young spring chicken himself, we would have nothing to work from. Our culture would effectively die. It's really the only publishing house out there doing that stuff, and they do it cheaply. These books are like $35. So Thank you very much for that. Okay, so if you would like to help us actually make more of this content, because it takes time and money to make it, please, you'll see there's a thank you button down there. Shoot us a few bucks, $5, $10, whatever you can do. If enough of that comes in, we can afford to take more and more time, and I can even maybe feed poor Richard here, because he's not making any money off.
Well, I've had one meal a day.
He's at 1 meal a week. It would really help. So see that thank you button down below? Shoot us a few bucks, we can make more of this stuff. Thank you. We will see you on the next one.